Good morning. I'm Janice Clay, chair of the Civic Caucus, a group dedicated to thoughtful, nonpartisan debate and discussion of issues important to Minnesota. Today, the Civic Caucus interview group will be talking about Minnesota's property tax-based sharing law, often called the Minnesota Miracle, on the books for some 50 years now. The origins of this achievement is a story filled with drama, leadership, and good public policy. We have with us today two people who are among those who know those origins the very best. Clarence Schellbetter will be our moderator, and he will introduce Paul Gilje, who's written an excellent new book on the topic. Thank you both, and Clarence, we'll turn to you now.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the initial introduction, Janice. Paul, as many of us know, is a longtime active member of the Civic Caucus, where among other things, he is a superb questioner. Before that, for 24 years, he was the research director of the Citizens League, where from 1964 to 1988, he assisted the executive committee and the program committee in identifying issues that needed study by the Citizen League committees. He was also a primary contact and trainer of new research associates like myself and many others. He worked with the committees, encouraging them, showing them how the league study process worked. In that capacity, he reviewed how committees were going, made suggestions, and reviewed the emerging reports. While doing all this, he was also the primary staff of several committees. One of these was the Fiscal Disparities Committee, beginning in 1967. Paul came from a background in journalism as a reporter for the afternoon Minneapolis Star. He is a journalism graduate of St. Olaf College and Northwestern University, and as a resident growing up in Carrington, North Dakota, he worked at the feet of his newspaper publisher father, while he lived among the many Lutheran Norwegian relatives. Paul will discuss, as Janice told us, the results of his recent book, How Could You Do This? The book does an amazing job of detailing the history of what is known by some as the problem of fiscal disparities, and by others as the solution or remedy, tax-based sharing. Today, we hear much about various disparities in our world and in this state, including those that relate to K-12 educational achievement and healthcare. What we will hear about today is a little told story about how a group of citizens in 1967 to 69 identified significant disparities or differences in tax-based wealth available to cities and school districts in the growing Twin Cities metro area. How they came to understand this and the conclusions they arrived at and their suggested solutions or recommendations and the steps to implement them. I've asked Paul to please introduce his guests, some of whom may be with us today, who were engaged in and are knowledgeable about possibly this most significant, certainly the most ingenious report done by the Citizens League. Amazingly, it remains today almost unchanged, with great impact in distributing the value of commercial industrial development equitably for property tax purposes around the Twin Cities metro area. I'd like to introduce Paul Gilje.
Thank you, Clarence. By the way, just as we were talking here, I got a text from Steve Hines saying, I bet you cookie to a donut that I screwed up in sending out the correct Zoom, which just makes me want to scream and swear at the same time about how difficult it is to get something simple done. So I'm just inclined here to, if I could find the, I don't think any of you has Steve Hines's email address. If you did, you could send it to him. Janice, you don't have it, do you?
You know, I bet I can find it quickly. So I'll take a look.
And send him, if you can find it and send it to him, that'd be great.
Okay,
well, let me just let's get on with it here. I'd like to express my thanks to the Civic Caucus for inviting me to share this story with you today. And Janice has been kind enough to set aside the next 12 meetings of the Civic Caucus so we can explore this in detail. And I'm particularly grateful for that. The the reason that it's attractive in some respects is simply, number one, that next July, mid-July, will be the 50th anniversary of Wendy Anderson signing into law the Metropolitan Tax Base Sharing Law. And it's been 50 years of adventure involving court cases and challenges from all kinds of different directions, including ongoing efforts of the Mall of America to get exempt. And we can talk about all those things. But I'd like to highlight, if I might, that there really are about 4 reasons why we're bringing this to your attention today. First, of course, is the 50th anniversary. Second is the process that the Citizens League followed in coming up with its proposal. That process has been laid out by Helen Baer, and later in the program today, I will hope that somebody raises the question of what that process was like, and she's got it all ready to share with you. Second was the process followed by the legislature itself, and the fact that a very contentious body, as contentious then as it is today, could come up with some consensus with a variety of ways they voted. And then third is the fact that the proposal itself is so appropriate for the Center for Policy Design, and that's why we're very delighted that they would agree to publish the book. And that is that it represents a new way of thinking that would never have occurred to the people in the property tax business. It wouldn't have in a million years come out of the county auditors or anything like that, because they never thought it would be possible. And it was because one person, who happened to be in the finance business, by the way, and we'll get into that, came up with it. The idea had got traction, but it never would have happened if we had stuck with the rules of the game or thinking inside the box, however you want to do. So those key things are the dimensions of the property tax base sharing idea. Now, let me quickly return to pre-1971. The law was passed in 1971, but before 1971, the metropolitan area communities, in fact, across the nation, there was a tradition, very definitely built into the system, that whatever you had within your borders, that is what you got to tax for property. And property tax was big in those days, it's big today. Today, I think it raises something like $500 million a year, or 500 billion a year in America. But in those days, it was still big. And if you could attract the businesses in your community, you got to tax them 100%. And that's the way the game was played. If you were in Mankato or St. Cloud, it really didn't matter, because you lived, you worked, you shopped, all in the same community. So you got the tax benefit from the store you shopped at, or the place you worked, or the entertainment facility you attended. So there was no problem there. But in the post-war era, as the metropolitan areas emerged, we immediately began to see a striking difference in which some communities became largely all bedrooms and some communities became largely all business. In fact, I think there's a town somewhere out east called Property Tax, or the Tax Town. I forget what it is, but it's almost named for its nature. And so this was the problem that was being faced, is that you had different levels of wealth from community to community based on what they could encourage, irrespective of the fact that some places near an airport benefited, places that weren't near an airport were stuck with what they could get, or because of the nature of the land or the lack of amenities such as parks or lakes. There's no accident, of course, that Lake Minnetonka and White Bear Lake attracted very expensive homes. So we had these differences that were existing. It wasn't just the differences, however, it was also the level of service that was possible. And in the early days of the Citizens League, we would point out that not only did such and such a community have the lowest property tax on it, please excuse me, an $18,000 house, but not they had on top of that, they would have the highest spending per child in schools or the highest salaries. And so not only they have lower taxes, they had higher services. And that was really causing a dilemma. Then further, you had the Metropolitan Council just having been created, and it was thinking about a second airport. The Metropolitan Airports Commission wanted to build a second airport in a place called Ham Lake. Well, if you lived in Edina or Bloomington, you said, where in the hell's Ham Lake? Well, Ham Lake was located up in Anoka County, and the Anoka County people who were starved for tax base were just itching to get that airport, because then the airport would bring new development. Well, as it turned out, the Metropolitan Council vetoed that proposal and decided we're going to stick with one airport. Probably was the right decision, but it certainly disappointed the people up north wanting that. So this was the setting in 1971 and 1969-71 when the Citizens League Fiscal Disparities Committee was operating. And as Clarence points out, fiscal disparities is the problem, tax-based sharing is the answer. And the committee was looking at these wide differences in tax base, also looking at the incentives that municipalities had. I recall that one meeting of the Citizens League Fiscal Disparities Committee, John Pidgeon, the city manager of Bloomington, and Dick Turnland, the city manager of Roseville, came in and talked about the fact that they engaged in what's called fiscal zoning, which was you zone your community to attract that kind of development, which would come close or exceed paying its own way in property tax. So if you brought in a church, of course, the church wouldn't pay any taxes, so there'd be no benefit for that from a tax-based standpoint. But if you brought in a warehouse, you'd get all the benefit from that warehouse without having to educate any kids, and had a minimum amount of municipal services. So that was a very, very common thing. And in housing, it was particularly egregious, because in housing, here in the world, you would benefit by zoning out lower priced housing and only welcoming higher priced housing. And it did this very openly. Well, that was not good for the population as either. So it was in this environment then that the Citizens League came up with its study committee. And during the time it was studying that, came up with some very obvious but difficult solutions. One solution as they looked at this was, what the heck? Let's see if we can impose a new tax on the metro area, say a tax on sales, and collect the money centrally and distribute it to all the municipalities. Not a bad idea. Not a good idea from the standpoint of a legislator who didn't want to have to run for re-election on a new tax. So whereas appealing that was, it was also very difficult. Somebody else would say, well, what the heck? What we need to do is merge the municipalities into one. We got too many of them. We got 190 of them. Well, yeah, okay, let's try that. After having tried years to merge such little hamlets as Mound and Island Park, or closer in the metropolitan area, Edina and Morningside, or a few others like that, very, very little merger ever occurred, and likelihood of it happening was very remote. I might just have an aside here, and some of you might have seen it in the book. There are a couple of examples of early mergers that could have happened that would have produced some fascinating developments. I'll just mention one in passing. When the Hennepin County Board in the mid 1860s set up Richfield Township started at Lake Street and extended to 494. Of course, there was no 494 in those days. And on the east, the river, and on the west, 169. What the hell? If we had that town today, we'd have the biggest doggone municipality in the metro area. Well, those kinds of mergers extended to some extent, but not widespread. Then, of course, you could also talk about state aid or moving functions to a higher level. We could have the state take over law enforcement or something like that. Well, again, very difficult. Well, it was in this environment of difficult solutions to the fiscal zoning problem that a fellow involved in municipal bonds on the school board in Burnsville, of all places, I'll tell you later why Burnsville of all places, Warren Preacher was sitting on the Citizens League Fiscal Disparities Committee. And on December 14th, 1968, at the Midway Pancake House at the corner of Lexington and University, hours, just a few minutes before the committee was meeting at the Lexington branch of the St. Paul Public Library for its regular meeting, Warren Preacher pulled out of his briefcase a 3-page memo, passed it across to me over the hamburgers we were enjoying. And that was the first announcement of anything like tax-based sharing. What he was suggesting is that you could take the physical buildings and move their valuations legally, albeit not physically. So Helen, let's put the slide back up again of our friend. I've often said that here's what happened is that's Paul Bunyan, by the way. He comes out of the North Woods with a big scissors, comes down to the metro area and snips off a few floors from the IDS tower and snips off some buildings out of Southdale and goes over and picks some parts of a warehouse, gathers them all together, and then sets them back down again in different places around the metro area. That is exactly what has happened legally, even not physically, over the last 50 years. So we in Apple Valley this past year celebrated a new Menards store down the street. Well, nobody in my community realizes it, but only 60% of the value of that building sticks in Apple Valley. The other 40% is being shared by Richfield, Robbinsdale, Rogers, who knows where, all around the metropolitan area. So that was the change, a very significant one that did not disrupt the local power of the city council to make its own decisions, did not have somebody else interfering with their decisions on what they would do, and they still controlled their local tax rate. Now, one could be skeptical and say, how could that be possible? Because they would get this new development, they would tax that higher. Well, not necessarily, because whatever tax rate you wanted to apply to that piece of Southdale that you now have, you had to apply to your resident homeowner and other apartment builders. So the tax rate that is applied to the commercial had to apply to everybody else in your town too, which was the traditional way of holding down spending. In fact, Salisbury Adams, a conservative legislator from the Wayzata area, was intrigued by the concept of tax-based sharing because the very wealthy communities, which had all the growth, would not be so incented to spend more because they had it, because they didn't have it anymore. They constrained their spending to some degree. And so he saw a benefit from the tax base from that standpoint. So the tax-based sharing concept emerged from the Citizens League. Now, another dimension of this is the Citizens League process for study. Very key in 1969-71, very key today. And I've asked Helen Baer later on in this meeting to outline that the way she has prepared it for this today. And I want us to make sure we don't forget about covering the process of the Citizens League as we continue the discussion. So March of 1969, the proposal emerges. In July of 1971, 2.5 years later, it's enacted into law. Now, there were very, very dramatic things that happened during that 2-year period that we can touch on to some degree. For example, Jerry Blatz, who served as the chair of the Senate Tax Committee in 1971. Jerry Blatz was from Bloomington, strongly opposed to tax-based sharing, but for various reasons, Blatz did not exploit his position to insist that the bill be referred to his body. Fascinating. You also had some very real difficulty in getting the Senate and the House to agree. One thing that made tax-based sharing very, very attractive, however, was that Charlie Weaver, representative from Anoka, grabbed onto the concept of tax-based sharing immediately, shepherded it through, got Wayne Popham from Minneapolis to be his co-author in the Senate, and the two of them gathered that through over 2 sessions and saw that it got ultimately implemented. One can't overemphasize the importance of Weaver, and Weaver, a conservative, and Popham, a conservative, both were able to engender good support from their Democratic colleagues. Martin Sabo, for example, the minority head in the House, became an author on the Weaver bill in the House, and then Nick Coleman, the minority leader in the Senate, became an author on Popham's bill in the Senate. Both very, very critical elements in approval. And later on in the discussion, that came to pass. Well, I want to make sure we do not deny us a chance here to have good discussion. We can discuss the various elements of what it was that produced the agreement within the Senate and House in those 2 years. And obviously, everybody's going to say, people asking me for years, well, we could never do that today. We're so terribly polar. Well, I'd like to challenge that assumption in various ways, including the importance of the process that Helen's going to discuss, because that was so key. But then once the law did get enacted in 1971, no sooner had that happened than the city of Burnsville took us to court right away and won in the district court and got it overruled unconstitutional. Now that was fascinating because Warren Preschel was from Burnsville and Paul Gilje was from Burnsville, and our communities were strongly against getting it passed. The Brunig decision, holding it unconstitutional, held it up then for a while. It went to the Supreme Court, but the leadership in the Citizens League, the lawyer leadership, Earl Coburn, Alan Sakes, Bill Frenzel, and Bill was not, Bill Frenzel was the leader. He was not in the legislature. Greer Lockhart and David Graven, those four were immensely critical in preparing what are called amicus briefs to the Supreme Court. We had 2 major Supreme Court decisions on the Metropolitan Law. And then I think many of you know that the law did also pass a separate law, almost identical for the cities on the Iron Range. And there was a Supreme Court decision on that as well to find it constitutional. So we had a real drama there. Then following that, we had the immediate efforts to hobble the law or make it almost ineffectual by changing the rules. And on the heels of that came up something called tax increment financing. Now that's where everybody's eyes are glazing over and wondering, don't get into that with me. Well, Helen and Janice, we didn't tell them, did we, about the test we're offering at the end of the meeting on tax-based sharing itself. I guess we shouldn't overlook that. But anyway, the challenge to tax-based sharing, that other people had their eyes on that growth, not just for sharing the tax base, but for grabbing it off and taxing it separately and using the revenue from that to encourage new development in the city. That's been a very, very big dimension. But thankfully, back in 1979, the legislature took action to make sure that there would not be any stealing of the tax base for tax income financing. We could get into that in some detail as well.
Oh.
Shortly, or you want to get into it? I don't, but I will. Then shortly after that, the big announcement came out that the old Met Stadium on 494 and Cedar was going to be torn down, and Bloomington had 100 acres within, what, a mile of the airport, less than that, a couple of blocks for development. That then turned onto something that for the next, what, 85 to 2013, how many years is that? Almost 30 years of controversy over how you tax the great big elements in the region. Because one could say, I remember myself, I thought, what the heck? We got this great big development occurring. That's going to be ideal for tax-based sharing because everybody can get the benefit of it. The number one, as soon as the thing was announced, the city of Bloomington and the Mall of America made all kinds of efforts to get exempt. And they tried 3 times and didn't succeed. Well, 3 times and out, right? Not on your life. Not on your life. The very astute legislators from Bloomington and Eden Prairie were able to get $100,000 appropriation to do a big fat study, 230 pages of text that really weighed much more than the recommendations did. But that provided all the weight that they needed so that in 2013, the legislature gave the Mall of America a 20-year break. And so it won't be until 2034, 2035 that the Mall of America will be shared. Meanwhile, as all of this is going on, there has been just intense interest nationally. I'm just about done. Intense interest nationally. Early on, the city of Sacramento, California tried to share sales tax. That didn't succeed. It did get, I think it passed one body. Governor Milliken from Michigan tried to get tax-based sharing enacted. There was activity in Des Moines, Iowa, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Allentown, Pennsylvania. The most striking similarity happens to be across the river from New York City and New Jersey, known as the Meadowlands, where 14 cities share their tax base there. That's the closest thing that approximates. Another one is an old steel plant in the Pittsburgh area where 3 suburbs are still under tax-based sharing or under tax increment financing. And after that's expired, they're planning to share the tax base the way we share it here. So that's the story in a nutshell. And I'm very, very sad to report to you how few of the people that I contacted got the thing, because I apparently sent them the wrong link. And it just makes me want to swear, but given the religious nature of all of us, I'll off. So you're on, Janice or Paul or Clarence. Go ahead and make sure you ask Helen a question about the process.
Okay, and Paul, can you just list the names again so I can make sure I found them? The ones you invited?
Yeah, Bob DeBoer was going to be on today. He's with the Council on Fiscal Excellence. Steve Hines, who knows more about tax-based sharing than anybody else.
Yep, and he's here.
House research employee. Jared Swanson. Jared is the successor to Steve Hines in House research. I might just interject here at this point. House research in Minnesota is, I gotta believe it has no parallel anywhere in that its insistence on nonpartisan research for both bodies has done it over the last 50 years, been invaluable in the tax-based sharing area with 3 major reports, just terrific action. Steve Dornfeld, who wrote articles for the Minneapolis Tribune when tax-based sharing was enacted in 1971, and then wrote again a major article in 2013 after the Mall of America got its exemption. Tom Berg, state representative, who was very helpful both on the passage of the school aids and the other in the Minnesota Miracle. That's another dimension we didn't get into, we should get. And then Alan Albert, who is the fellow with Harvard who wrote the big history on tax-based sharing and the Minnesota legislature. And without his hard work in 1978, 79, we wouldn't have the detail we have today. Those are the ones, Jeff, I thought were going to be here.
Okay, and actually Steve Hines, I see, has joined us. So
welcome. Good.
Hello.
Steve, sorry I screwed up. Glad you'd be here with me.
I got the revised link from Janice, and so I got in.
Okay, thank you. Good.
Yes.
You can all address questions to Hines from now on if you want to get the truth.
Oh, God.
Well, Mr. Chair, does it make sense to hear from Helen now about that process?
I
Yeah,
think it'd be terrific.
Cheers.
Okay, sure. I will go ahead. I have some visuals about the Citizens League study process coming from someone who was not a part of it. But Paul sent me some language about this and I admired the ideas. It's something unlike what I've seen before. So I just want to run through this. As far as the selection of study topics, part of that process was taking initiative on topic selection, not just reviewing proposals put out by others, as well as maintaining a large list of possible topics consistently running. Another key factor was stressing the problem to be addressed, not the solution to be explored. That emphasis on the problem to be addressed and what really is the problem was crucial.
And typically when that was done, you ended up with what's called the findings of a report, where they had collected what they discovered were the aspects of the problem. Go ahead.
Yep. Clarence is getting there before I am.
Okay, go ahead.
In the study process, it was crucial to stress learning over debating. This is an inquiry.
Let me interrupt you right at that point, because you were nice enough not to include the slogan that we have heard repeatedly. It comes up at almost every study group that comes together. We all know what the problem is. Let's not waste any time talking about that. Let's get on with the solution. Oh yeah, I guess you do have it down there.
I've got it. I should be letting you guys
No, go ahead. Go through it again. I apologize.
Yeah. Avoid cutting corners, such as the one Paul just discussed. And additionally, Dana mentioned this the other day, but using staff as generalists, not as experts, and inviting in outside experts to then inform the group. And additionally, not just yielding the upper hand to the people who are the more knowledgeable in the group, but having everyone learn together as a way to increase camaraderie among the group as well.
Ellen, can I just interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily the staff as generalists, the committee members were generalists, not experts or special interests. That was a key factor on the committees.
Thank you. Yes, please continue to jump in. This is
I never got invited to be on committees because I was an expert on too many things. So.
Well,
And
it
still are.
It is a story in the league's history when, while we did try to adhere to that principle, the reality was that a lot of the specialists, the folks who were professionally trained in a given subject area, began to see how effective the Citizens League process was in changing things, and they insisted and wanted to be on these committees. And it became a big issue for the board about how do you begin to ensure that the generalists in effect stay in charge. And so we had some committees in the latter years where all of these other folks, the specialists of the people who were responsible for all kinds of things, came and they had to sit on the outside perimeter and only the generalists could sit at the table.
Wow, that's so interesting. All right, I'm gonna
Gilje here. I need to just offer a little bit of comment on this point, because if one looks back at the committee that developed this tax-based sharing proposal, we had on that committee Frank Boddy, professor of economics at the University of Minnesota, Bob Ehlers, who is in the business of a consulting on finance to municipalities, Peter Meintsema, the mayor of Crystal, Gordon Moe, the city assessor for Minneapolis, Warren Preschel, who was himself, of course, involved in the fiscal business, Tom Ryersgord, a employee on the city staff in St. Louis Park, Bill Shaw, a lawyer who was involved in a lot of tax stuff, Tom Vassley, was head of the Board of Estimate and Taxation in Minneapolis. Don Walland, who was the chief finance officer for the Minneapolis Public Schools. Norm Werner, who was a finance guy for communities in Anoka County. And Art Whitney, probably the most respected property tax lawyer in all of Minnesota. These people were sitting on the committee. And when I think back on this issue, I can't help but say that they kept us from naivete. So somehow the concept of bringing people together, some of whom know a lot more than others, but you don't let the people who know more than others dominate the discussion, but you insist that everybody learn together for a period of time, gives the people who aren't as expert more courage than to step in. Further, there was just maybe an understanding that people who had these expert positions did not exploit them. So I've had a real quandary for the last many years as to how one achieves that very critical balance between the experts and the non-experts.
Who was chair?
Earl Colborn was. Earl Colborn.
Oh,
Yeah, and Earl was had chaired a property tax committee of the Citizens League a couple years earlier than that. So he was a faithful leader in the Citizens League. I don't think Earl had any property tax specialty in his law firm.
All right. Well, I'll keep running then with sharing of the information. So, you know, once this study process has taken place, how do we share this? So it was crucial that detailed records were kept, and, you know, learning was shared with outsiders as broadly as was possible. And an insistence upon a broad assortment of viewpoints being brought to the attention of group. And Paul was saying that diversity of input might be more easily realized and maybe even more critical than diversity of membership among the group.
A little prejudice thinking in there, Gilje.
Well, I think it's important to also emphasize these detailed records consisted of a very long, some would say too long, set of what we called minutes. They weren't verbatim, but they were a summary of every statement that was made by every person that came to the committee, and then of the internal discussions. So these minutes, we call them, were uniquely different than you'll see in other places. And it was key to the discussion that would go, because sometimes the key questions that various people would start asking were captured in these minutes. So they were something that the chair and others could go back and say, this is what the question is.
Clarence, that's a very good point. And with tax-based sharing minutes, it is possible for you today, this day, to have access to the most important ones. We were able, before COVID got in here, we were able to get access to some of that data in a warehouse in Egan, where Citizens League records are kept, as well as the Historical Society's records. And then we were able to get those things copied. And so when one goes to the endnotes of the book, you'll get the actual URL that you can click on and get those exact minutes to be able to see what they were like. And I might add that the minutes of the, who's the guy from the university, the guy who was in Builder, Larry Locke. Larry Locke just died about, what, 2-3 months ago?
Right.
And Larry spoke to the committee when he was a developer and talked about the fiscal zoning thing so articulately. And the same way was with, I think I mentioned earlier, how the record of the minutes of Richard Turnland from Roseville and John Pidgeon from Bloomington, the city managers talked candidly about their roles. Those are still available to this day, as well as we had a speaker from the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank, Lynn Stiles, who shared with his insights on this. So those records were, as you pointed out, very critical. And the other dimension of the record is not so much for the benefit of the people that were members, but for the outsiders.
Yeah.
We had another committee I staffed in 1971 dealt with the Higher Education Coordinating Board, which I don't think exists anymore. But in those days, it existed with representatives from all the institutions of higher learning. Our committee, headed by Alan Sakes, was critical of that concept, or the people were asking questions critical. Sounds like all you've got is just a United Nations. You're not going to make any progress when you've got only people representing the various interest groups. Well, Rod Searle, representative from Waseca, got those minutes, and doggone it, one day I opened up the paper and noticed that the legislature had knocked them off, and had changed the law before we had a chance to make the recommendation. So that was an indication of how vital it was to share this stuff broadly, because others were following you as well.
Right.
The other thing I would point out is that, and Paul's very modest and doesn't highlight it, but the reality was that the committee understood that they could be asking this staff person who was recording these minutes to also get some information on the following kinds of questions. So the staff is kept busy, not only doing the minutes, but finding information to respond to the questions that the committee was asking. So I don't know exactly what Paul did in that instance, but I'm sure he was pulling together the information about these disparities by community. And they had this kind of data in front of them. So there's an active response to data questions that are getting raised by the committee, and the committee is being informed with this information in addition to what the speakers are saying.
All right.
Helen, have you finished your presentation?
I've got two left. So
Good. Go on.
next section is the conclusions and recommendations. So early drafts were prepared with findings and conclusions, not yet with recommendations. And it was crucial to insist on optional possibilities, many different possibilities, rather than focusing just on one possibility. And it was important to be open to new possibilities rather than just being held to conventional thought. And the last quote I'll leave you with is something Paul said, is that creative new ideas might not succeed themselves, but these can stimulate people to come up with better ideas.
Yeah.
Do we mean succeed or
the ideas themselves may not succeed at a given time. Yeah, that may be ambiguous.
Got it.
Or look at it this way, that something new like tax-based sharing was extremely fragile. I mean, it did not generate great response initially within the Citizens League Fiscal Disparities Committee. It was fighting all kinds of other ideas that were on the table. There were people that were very nervous about changing the system. So it was not by any means. You had to work hard to just keep that concept alive. And then in so doing that, then new ideas emerged. For example, within the tax-based sharing, the concept started out, we need to share all of the existing development in the metro area. Well, very quickly, new thoughts came out that we don't need to share that which is already here. All you need to do is to change the rules of the game for the stuff that's coming in the future. So a very critical element in the final approval of tax-based sharing was that nobody loses what he has today. You only share what comes in the future, and nobody knows for sure what's going to happen in the future. So you're a little bit, you don't have to talk about taking anything away from what somebody already has.
Yeah. God.
There's plenty of people here that have not asked a question. And I think we ought to insist that John Adams ask a question.
Paul, I do have a question, and we talked about it a little bit when you were preparing the book. And that is the very statute in the state law that requires local units of government to raise their own revenues is part of the source of this issue. Was there ever a discussion in the committee of moving municipal finance to the state level and let the state collect for all the units of government in the state and then redistribute it, which is very common in many parts of the world where we have unitary governments and the local units of government are creatures of the state, but the central government collects the revenue and then distributes it according to need to the local level. Was that kind of issue ever discussed? Because it's a version of what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank
Go
you. Let me just enlarge that by using it as an excuse to get into the Minnesota Miracle. Clearly, what John is talking about is to make the state be the revenue raiser and the decision maker on this distribution of funds rather than the local municipality. And in 1971, as if probably true in 2021, there was clearly a very strong antipathy towards higher levels of government making decisions for us as to how we spend our money, where we get our money. So I'd have to say, John, that I don't recall that issue coming up, but it was a supplement to the Citizens League report on tax-based sharing, was a separate recommendation dealing with a state aid program for municipalities and school districts. That was part of the program. It did not get acted on in '69, but then in one of these really unusual developments, we have to remind ourselves of what happened when. In 1969, 1970, the Citizens League convened another committee. And that committee looked at the sole matter of school district and municipal finance, came up with the very dramatic proposal in September of 1970 for a municipal aid program from the state, and second, a vastly improved school aid program that eliminated, well, that substantially reduced the differences in ability to pay that was present, and added into it the third dimension, which was special aid for disadvantaged children. That school proposal, school municipal proposal, is what's really called the Minnesota Miracle. And that was tying up the legislature in knots during the 1971 special session that extended into October. But during that time, tax-based sharing snuck in and got adopted as a separate element, but has been, and rightfully so, the combination of tax-based sharing and the municipal school aids has been regarded as the major package that was enacted in that year.
That's good. Thank you.
Could I ask a question? I'm interested in what were the arguments for and against tax-based sharing in the court, and what ultimately was sort of the constitutional basis on which it was approved.
Yeah. This is where I wish Jack Windhorst were here, but I'll give him some credit before I attempt to answer your question. Jack Windhorst is the person who did more than anybody else. His dad was on the board of the Citizens League in those years. His dad was part of the Dorsey Owen Windhorst Weston Halliday firm, and also Art Whitney was on that firm as well. And Jack was a young lawyer in that firm who was invited in 1971 or 1969 to take Charlie Weaver's proposal, which was the Citizens League proposal, and draft it into law, into bill form. And Jack did that, and his hard work is still present to this day. Now, getting to the question of why the court case came up, the concept was just pretty clear that you had to have tax, everybody within the same unit of government had to be taxed the same. And when Judge Brunig ruled constitutionally that it was wrong, he was noting that in a given municipality, under the new law, the actual burden paid by commercial industrial within that municipality will be slightly different from the burden, the tax rate imposed on other properties. And he noted that that fact meant that it was violating the equal protection under the laws. And so Brunig ruled that unconstitutional. It came then to the Supreme Court. There was some, Steve Hines, are you there?
He's there.
I'm here, but I really don't know much about this subject.
Yeah, I'll ask you to at least correct me if
Sure.
I'm wrong. Then we come to the Supreme Court, and there Justice Otis, in a major action on his part, says that if we followed traditional things, there would be no reason for us to overrule the thing. Let me now read to you the thing. Our decision to reverse, that is the decision to make it constitutional, hinges on what we deem to be a developing concept of the meaning of the word benefit. It seems to us that the phrase special benefit no longer adequately serves the constitutional requirement of uniformity. In a 7-county area, which is heavily populated, we are of the opinion that it is no longer necessary for units of government providing tax revenue to receive the kind of tangible and specific benefits to which our court has previously referred in order to satisfy the uniformity clause. And he goes on, and then he has this major thing where he says, we find the arguments of the defendants, that is the people who are supporting tax-based sharing, persuasive. Under existing tax-based practices, in order to improve their fiscal capacity, local units of government vie for commerce and industry to improve the fiscal capacity of its residents without considering the resulting impact on long-range planning and the utilization of the resources. The 7-county area is, as pointed out, a high degree of mobility and political, social, and economic interdependence. So it was a very far-reaching opinion that Justice Otis came up with. By the way, he's the father of Todd Otis. And as we point out in the book, the Otis connection goes back to the founding fathers, but I'll let you read that separately rather than talk about it here. Steve Hines, do you want to comment any further on the constitutionality issue?
Paul, I don't really have much to say on that. That had all been settled by the time I showed up on the scene, and I never really dug into it much. And I was, as you mentioned, as we were going through the process, happy to have Jack there to provide all that, but I couldn't add anything to what you said.
Okay, thank you.
So Paul, I have a question for you, and that is about local government aid. First of all, where were we with local government aid at that point in time? I'm not remembering the legislative history of that. And then second, local government aid, of course, as you well know, has a large number of factors that relate to need. So they don't, you know, whereas as I understand it, fiscal disparities is more solely on the issue of the ability to raise money. And of course, that's always been a huge issue for Minneapolis, that has traditionally had a very big commercial industrial base, but also great need. So how did those conversations come into play in reference to the fiscal disparities legislation?
Yeah, I guess I did point out that I don't know if it was punting or it was making it easier for us, because we did make a recommendation on municipal aid as part of the tax-based sharing report. So it was there. But in 1967-69, the first inklings of local government aid showed up in 1967. That was when the sales tax got enacted, the 3% sales tax in the state. And a portion of that sales tax was dedicated to municipalities, and a portion of that sales tax was dedicated to schools. It wasn't an awful lot. It might have been 3/4 of 1%. I can't recall what. Then what we had is the controversies over growing levels of the property tax that led to the major discussion in 70 and 71, where a new form of municipal aid taking into consideration those elements of need came up. And then, of course, with schools as well. I might add, Paul, that what was really, in my opinion, the determining factor on municipal aid was the fact that the school aid by itself was not going to help Minneapolis and St. Paul. Minneapolis and St. Paul have always had a high level of property tax wealth relative to the number of kids, even back in 1971. But the very alert and astute legislators saw that if they could get funds for municipal services for Minneapolis and St. Paul, that would offset the benefits that the schools got. So the combination of municipal and school came together in the Minnesota Miracle Act of 1971. And that's how they got that established. And of course, LGA has been a big part of the picture ever since. That's the best way I can answer. Steve Hines, have you got anything to add on that?
Well, I would just point out that, part of the recommendations of the Citizens League Committee and what ultimately got adopted in the tax-based sharing law was, a municipal government aid program. And, we've often speculated if that had actually passed first, if LGA had come into place and the school aid formula, if that would have killed tax-based sharing, that there two of the big arguments for not equalization were kind of taken care of arguably by those provisions. And but the fact that they weren't in place at the time it was adopted, I think was probably critical. So just an odd mix of circumstances in that 69 to 71 era that allowed all of it to happen. So that's about all I would add to it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Steve. Thank you. That's right. Tax-based sharing would not have passed if municipal and school aid had been enacted first.
Yet a difference that's now obvious that maybe wouldn't have been at the time is LGA and to some extent school aids also are subject to the variabilities of state legislative and state government budgets and other constraints and tend to fluctuate, whereas the fiscal disparities program has been very, constant in terms of how it works because no state level governmental actors have to get involved. It just happens each year and you continue to have the sharing. If you had not done tax-based sharing because you had LGA, can go negative or, can not increase in some years and even go down. So it's kind of interesting how they do interact, but I think the rationale is different.
Yeah. So I think that I was an administrative analyst in the city coordinator's office in Minneapolis, and I wrote the municipal overburden report that was done in the late 60s. And we, and at that time, I know the leadership in the city weren't supporting fiscal disparities. They thought that Minneapolis would lose, although obviously there were legislators that were supporting it. But one of the things that I think clearly with if municipal aid, local government aid hadn't been part of it, I don't know that they would have been able to get the Minneapolis delegation on board, probably St. Paul as well. And Martin Sabo was kind of a key person in making sure that local government aid was part of that package, as well as people like Tom Berg, and so that I think the whole package really was important to be able to get school aid, and then fiscal disparities kind of crept in there.
See, Lee Munich, you make a very good point. In fact, I think it needs to be even further stressed that the the matter of municipal aid was absolutely central to getting school aid passed. It would not have passed without that because of the impact on Minneapolis and St. Paul. Municipalities, Minneapolis and St. Paul needed that municipal aid, not just the school aid benefit. That was very key.
Paul, can you explain why, in fact, this proposal how it was implemented and apparently done by the county auditors every single year, but then also why it hasn't changed? I mean, it's pretty significant that it stayed in place and it's done.
Well, Clarence and I have talked a little bit about this matter of the fact that tax-based sharing today is virtually the same as what it was when it was passed in 71. One of the aspects of it is that it does not require a review by the legislature in every session. There is no appropriation involved. You don't with school aids and municipal aids, the legislature looks at it every session because they're spending money from the general fund. That's not the case here, that it functions just automatically. So that's one dimension. I'm not sure, Clarence, if I know why there has not been more attention placed. There have been major efforts to modify. Hennepin County in the late 80s, I think, went through a big effort to get tax-based sharing diminished significantly, either by reducing the percentage below 40% or outright repeal. And they were very strong in that effort. There were other efforts to reduce it down to 30%. There wasn't much action to the contrary. Why those efforts did not succeed, I'm not sure, but I think one could say that the bottom line always was that the number of municipalities that benefited from tax-based sharing vastly exceeded the number of municipalities that did not benefit. So that there was always a
Genius.
Yeah.
Another
Genius.
one thing I would point out too is that, you know, it's such a zero-sum game. It's such a, by definition, zero-sum game that any proposal to change it was going to create very easily identifiable winners and losers. So you could immediately put out a computer printout which was going to show who the winners were and who the losers were. And unlike a lot of things where you could kind of speculate, here it would be very easy to identify, and I think that's partly kept everything in check.
Yeah.
I would agree with you, Steve, on that 100%. I was part of the meanness in that area of preparing certain documents that were obviously indicating that all you're going to do is increase taxes for the poorest communities in the metro area. That was one of the best things that we did in '85 to kill the initial proposal to benefit the Mall of America.
And I think another sort of funny aspect of it is the 40% was an arbitrary number to begin with. So anybody who proposed changing it had to just propose a different arbitrary number from 40, and it was, you couldn't really have a nobody's able to present a rational number that would make sense other than the 40, I think. And so 40 is just kind of stuck, even though I know the story of how you got to 40 was kind of, but that's where it ended up. That's where it's always been.
So when I was on the city council in 1975, and they were considering the city center project as tax increment district, I argued that we should only account for 60% of the tax increment rather than 100%, because that's what we were getting back. And I was explaining this on a chalkboard to the city council, and Keith Ford, I was opposing city center, and Keith Ford got up and erased the board, and he said, forget what you just saw, and went on to, because people were so confused about the relationship between fiscal disparities and tax increment that just like you didn't want to get into it, Paul. And it passed without, even though I opposed it, but.
Oh,
So it didn't really cut down the incentive as much as some people might have thought for cities to go after their own economic development in their districts. But it did, I think, even out the distribution of wealth in the metro area.
Yeah. One issue
Am
we've
I-
not even touched on today, and I'm a little surprised we haven't, and that is, do we think at all that stressing the kind of environment that was present to produce the tax-based sharing law, that and stressing that process, that somehow that might get stimulate organizations here today to use that process for other purposes? And do we
Yes.
think that maybe the legislature, seeing what was possible, that you could be highly contentious and still make good progress?
yes,
Mhm.
yes.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Paul a related question. How much of the success that you've outlined in the book is a result of a sort of process template that can be used elsewhere, and how much has to do with a kind of serendipitous constellation of talented people that somehow happen to come together at a certain point in time to make it happen? And lastly, how much of it the success has to do with sort of the general affluence of that era
Yeah.
that made that sort of creativity and collaboration possible? So it's probably all of the above to varying degrees, but wondering your thoughts about your thoughts on that.
I like your question, and I hope others might want to respond as well. I couldn't help but think that, yeah, that serendipitous thing, lots of luck has to occur, and there was a good amount of luck that had to be present here in terms of Charlie Weaver having a good relationship with Ted Couldery, and they're having some conversation early on, and Weaver looking for a solution, and then getting the poker games at the Weaver house. We don't know how significant they were, but apparently Charlie was very close to his colleagues on both sides of the fence or aisle. We don't know the extent to which it was possible there for them to be doing some negotiating over poker in his house. By the way, I did some digging in that regard. Could never verify if people like Popham and Blatz were also at the Weaver home for poker. I never was able to see who all could be there. So that's true. I think the question I ask somewhat naive manner, Jeff, is whether today we could take that process the way Helen laid it out and use that in other environments as a way to stimulate getting better proposals on the table. And why aren't we doing that? I think of downstream and upstream. I think that too much of our attention today is on financing and the foundations, downstream solutions rather than upstream solutions. And it's hard to get your support for looking at something early before others do, but I think that would be very critical. Maybe somebody else has an observation on Jeff's question.
I don't have an observation on Jeff's question, but there's another thing that came up that hasn't been commented on when he said something about the prosperity of those days. Sometimes it's overlooked that the inflation at that period had the effect of pushing people into higher incomes, which automatically pushed them into higher tax brackets, which automatically meant the state was able to collect more revenue without deciding to raise taxes. And that extra revenue that the state was able to collect at that time did provide opportunities to do things that wouldn't have been possible had they had to decide to raise taxes. The tax collections increased because of the inflation and the way the inflation fit into the progressive income tax in Minnesota. Paul and I talked about that a little bit when he was preparing the book, but that's an underappreciated feature that allowed the administration and the legislature to do things that would not otherwise have been possible at that time. We didn't index taxes at that time, and that meant that more taxes were collected automatically.
Mhm. Okay, I wanted to just jump in and show off my brand new copy of this book. It just beautifully lays out so much of what you've been talking about, Paul. And I think, you do this process could help some of that polarization out there and get back to leadership, and just what a public policy achievement this was. So anyway,
you.
throwing this off.
Thank you.
Another,
We'll put in a link of how to get it for those watching on.
another book worth reading about that period is Tom Berg's book, where he documented a whole set of innovations that occurred. Minnesota Miracle is the one that's best known, but there were a lot of legislative innovations. And it was also a period where there were both Republicans and Democrats. I mean, there were Republicans who were, the Democrats were coming into power in the early 70s, but the Republicans who had worked on these issues in the 60s, there were a lot more innovative thinkers. And there was, even though there was still a lot of partisanship involved, there was more willingness to collaborate. And I think it's a much different time now in terms of the willingness or the ability of people who are sort of innovative thinkers to try to get those changes. The other thing that changed is that, the state is now, the metro area is now largely Democrat, and the rural areas are Republican. And in some ways, the Republicans in rural areas are against anything that will benefit the cities. And it's, so there's kind of a partisanship that is much stronger in kind of a negative way. So I'm less optimistic that there's that kind of ability to get these kinds of innovations today, although I certainly think it's a good model. And, I wish we had some of the kinds of legislators in both parties that we had at that time.
Can I just suggest at that point that I'm choosing to be hopeful in light of our current political situation? There are a lot of people at the legislature who I think would love to see something here modeled after what's become the Problem Solvers Caucus in Washington, D.C., which has gotten more and more play of late. And so one of the keys to encouraging legislators who want this kind of innovation and want to end the tribal politics, it seems to me, is to tell them these kinds of stories about how it can work. And one of the things I'd love to have people or have you respond to, Paul, because you've written this book, and some would say, well, gosh, 50 years ago, who cares what happened 50 years ago? It seems to be one of our challenges is to convince people what I think is the obvious, is that regardless of all the changes in media and technology, the in large part, the kind of basic rules of politics haven't changed in terms of what it takes to get things done. So the question for you, Paul, as you're writing this book, how do you respond to those people who are just going to say this is history? It's 50 years ago. People don't think this way anymore. It's not relevant anymore to what we're doing today. How do we? I think that's hogwash. But how do we convince people that history is relevant when so many don't think it is anymore?
Well, Paul, you know, in the Civic Caucus, we've talked about this for a few years, and our actual report back in 2016, 2017, stressed not so much the legislative side as the pre-legislative side, that the leadership in the communities developing ideas, that the legislature itself is not very good at coming up with new ideas. They are good at responding to other proposals.
Right.
And that we've got a foundation community that's why I think it looks to me like the foundations are justifiably, I can see why they do it, are concentrating more on downstream response than upstream. That is, they're looking at the helping the immediate needs of the organizations that are suffering, as against trying to look at first at how can one find a way to avoid this problem in the first place. So to get the foundations to open their minds more broadly, we had suggested in the Civic Caucus that an essential first step is to identify the unmet needs, so that we put together a list of 100 more issues facing the state of Minnesota and the metro area that need action. And we did that in the Civic Caucus 2 years ago, and it's on our website. That one would wish that somehow the organizations that are involved in study would grab onto those and make them try it to see if they could get it. That's what I would say would be critical, without first saying that, well, the legislature is so divided it can't take action. Maybe the community proposal group needs to be a little bit more aggressive on coming up with ideas and not so concerned that the legislature is the obstacle. Maybe the obstacle is the proposal community.
I have a question for both Steve and Lee. In 1971 especially, what was the role of the governor in all the deliberations around tax-based sharing or the municipal and state aid, school aid kind of thing?
The role of who?
Role of the governor in that time,
Okay.
by comparison with what you have seen in recent years. I mean, he's another player.
Well,
haven't talked about.
Well, as you recall, I mean, it was the election in 1970 between Wendell Anderson and Doug Head.
Right.
The school aid formula came up as an issue, and even though there've been some significant Republican leaders involved in the development of that, Doug Head came out against it, and Wendell Anderson came out in favor of it.
Right.
And that might have, so it was, you would have probably expected it to be the other way. And I think, Anderson probably, I think John Haynes, who was his political guy at the time, who was recommended that he support it. And so once he did, it became sort of, and was elected, it became a political mandate for him to do that. So I think he, because of the election, and that doesn't always happen, that an issue like this ends up, being formed. So I think Anderson was committed to that as a result of it, and had some pretty smart people around him, like John Haynes, who were able to kind of help that. And then you had Martin Sable and Nick Coleman and the people in the legislature that were with it. So I think the governor's leadership was important, but it was kind of an unusual situation in that it actually came into the campaign. Things like fiscal disparities and local government aid weren't, weren't really big issues, but I think that was that was something that that made a difference in
Well, I
that
understand
particular
that
year.
politically, but the mechanics then of translating this thing into a hard bill proposal that comes to a committee and gets advocated by, the role of the governor is pretty significant in that activity today. Very significant, certainly in the budget discussions, but even in other bill discussions. Was that present at that time? Was the governor taking leadership and having bills drafted and having his offices, his commissioners, going in and arguing about the merits of whatever? Or
Well,
is it-
Clarence Gilje here, I can't help but think that that you were aware that Jerry Christensen and John Haynes and Eileen Baumgartner were all heavily
Yeah.
involved in helping the governor. And I think they were drafting the bills pretty directly.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I think John
Yeah.
Cairns had a question.
You know, I remember in 71 and 73, the city council, as I recall it, was generally supportive of the base sharing, Gladys Brooks and I in particular. And it wasn't an issue. I mean, we didn't spend a lot of time on it because we just assumed it was going to continue. It was a good thing. Secondly, you've mentioned several names about the Minnesota Miracle, but the guy who understood it better than anybody was Doug Johnson from Cook. He was wildly underestimated in terms of his knowledge of the fiscal policies of the state. And there's no question he was ahead of just about everybody in understanding all the nuances. And there's no question he was able to favor the range, particularly for the many years he was chair of that committee. And he always had a plan that no one else could figure out or understand, but it always became law. And he was a very, very clever guy.
And the range always did very well in
You
those
bet you bet they did.
decisions.
And I also remember vaguely on Doug Hayes' campaign in '70, some discussions about this. And I know a few of us thought Doug just made a big mistake by not supporting the Minnesota Miracle. But he was pretty stubborn about it. It was basically, if Wendy's for it, I'm against it, which was pretty contrary to the way the legislature had been working before.
I have a question that is taking a little bit different turn from this, and Paul, I don't mean to put you on the spot if you don't have these numbers right there. I was thinking it would be interesting for everyone to hear what the disparities in property tax wealth were before fiscal or before tax-based sharing, and what they are today after tax-based sharing. Do you?
Oh, very nice, very nice. No trouble at all. If you take a look at the communities over 9,000 population, so that rules out the small towns, which have some dimensions that make the data not quite as accurate. Take the municipalities over 9,000 population, about 60 of them, and you say without tax-based sharing today, the difference in tax base per capita, commercial industrial tax base per capita, would be about 13 to 1. That is, the wealthiest would have 13 times as much commercial tax base as the poorest. With the law in effect, that ratio drops to 6 to 1.
Huh.
One, okay.
6 to 1. Yeah.
So one thing that I think is important about fiscal disparities is that these bond rating houses that regularly rate the bonds always cite fiscal disparities as one of the strengths of the metro area.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, can I just say something going back to the process that the Citizens League followed? And that was that the legislators who were interested were always kept aware of how the process was going on, so that Jack would know that there was a committee on what you were looking at, fiscal disparities, or no, who even thought that who even in the legislature really understood fiscal disparities. But the legislature kept people informed that this was maybe a subject that would require legislative action at some point, so that by the time you got to the legislature, there was a receptivity in saying, yeah, that's a really interesting idea, which is what it takes. And again, the whole process depended on their coming to the Citizens League, coming to the legislature with the proposal on a silver platter so that they could look at it and dissect it and analyze it. But you didn't depend on the legislature to come up with the specifics, which now people are. And
Pat, you just mentioned two very critical elements, and I'll say amen to both of them. The one about keeping people informed. There is a tendency on the part of any group that gets together. We've got to be pretty cautious about letting the outsiders know what's going on. And if you adopted in the Citizens League, as we did, the concept of it's even better for everybody to know what's going on, even if you're not that proud of it, because they're thinking and you're thinking. So that's one thing I agree with you wholeheartedly. The other matter is the specificity that you got to have, if you want to get attention, have something that a person, as you would say, Pat, can be put into law, that the bill can be drafted. And that was the key thing on tax-based sharing. It was clearly specific enough so that Jack Windhorst could take that and develop it. Yes, agreed on both points. Thank you.
The other comment I would have is that one of the things about the success of the tax-based sharing idea was that it evolved at the very time the Citizens League had been focusing a lot of energy for many years on an understanding of the regional development of the Twin Cities. And it had proposed a number of proposals dealing specifically with the region and the issues and the challenges that were arising, because it was no longer the city of Minneapolis and the city of St. Paul, but a growing area that encompassed, the Met Council said maybe 4 million people by 2000. That whole discussion was actively underway, and the legislature was aware of that whole discussion and had engaged in specific steps to begin to address those kinds of things. And interestingly, when it did so, it didn't do so necessarily from the turf of the interest group. In other words, it isn't like school aids, where the people involved in schools almost exclusively discuss the distribution of funds to schools. It was in the tax committee and in other committees where this discussion arose.
Yeah.
So there was a different way, a different group of people who got familiarized with it and engaged in it.
Clarence, I have heard, I don't know if this is true, Heinz might be able to comment on that the only time the school aid bill was decided in the tax committee was 1971. Every year before that, it was decided in the education committee, and every year since then, it's been the education committee.
Wow.
Are we going to go home? Are we all done?
Any other questions? Any other
Good
questions?
Lord, it's 10:30.
Oh, that's good.
An hour and a half into this.
One question.
It'll never end.
One more question. How important in the developing the idea and seeing it through was the compromise factor that we're not going to take 75% of your value. We won't even take 50%, but we'll take 40%. And other compromises along the way. How important were those into getting it passed and implemented?
Absolutely critical. Bill Frenzel early on came to Weaver and said, you got to give the communities a feeling that they get to keep at least half, at least a majority of their stuff. So he convinced Charlie to change from 50 to 40%. Very, yeah.
Okay.
That was Frenzel's action. The other other dimension of this is that the tax-based sharing law, Steve Hines and I figured this out this past year, doesn't do as much as you might think. We did some analysis and we concluded that 71% of the value gets sent back exactly to the same communities from which it came. So there's no change. It's only 29%, only 29% goes from the rich to the poor. So it's a very small, and we see that in the analyses that are done, that the difference in taxes with and without are not that great. That's again a service that the House research reports that Steve Hines has prepared demonstrate. So I think it's very critical. The question then, Dana, is it go far enough? And that's I guess I'd have to say that, sure, I'd love to see the pre-71 stuff be put in. I'd love to see it grow from 40 to 50 to 60%. But as soon as you start trying to fiddle with that, others are going to get in there and do their mischief, and you're going to cause more problems than not. So,
well, Paul, how about the effort to include more than just commercial industrial? How about expensive housing versus low-cost housing?
Yes, exactly. Right. Very good. Yep.
Because we had a proposal to do that.
Yep, that's right. And of course, we've also got proposals to exempt retail. That was the big push of the Mall of America folks, was that, look, we got all these police that ought to take care of all the robberies and things that occur at the retail space. We got to have enough money to cover that, so we ought not have to share retail. So yeah.
Can I ask? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all I'd have.
Can I ask one more thing, if I can remember now what I just had? What about the factors in distributing the money? It's the formula is largely based on population. That's sort of the overwhelming factor.
Yes.
Do you think there should have been more factors of need placed in the distribution formula?
Well, my answer is no, based on the fact that this is a rough redistribution. This is not the fine tuning that enables you to give money based on the number of AFDC kids in your district or anything comparable to that. But there's always been a feeling that it should have had more need dimensions into it. The academics who have looked at tax-based sharing are sometimes critical of the fact that the formula is too rough. But boy, I tell you, when you're thinking about this distribution, which is on capacity to raise revenue, not on the raising of the revenue, that is so darn critical when it gets to distribution of funds. When you're talking about distribution of revenue to the unit of government, then you can apply all sorts of sophistication to it. But when you're here, we are talking about need, when the action that's taken applies not only to municipalities, but to school districts and counties as well. This is helping the tax base of all these units. So it just makes it awfully difficult to add more factors of income in the community or the racial makeup or all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, related to that, Paul, is the amazing part of the story that the county auditors apparently went to work to do it and didn't object to the additional work that they had to do because of tax-based sharing.
I think that's the point. By the way, I didn't respond to Dana's question fully. The formula is population modified by whether you're above or below average in the metro area in total tax base. So if you're low on tax base, you get a little bit more than a population share. If you're high on tax base, you get a little bit less than a population share.
Okay.
That was added in by the Metro Council in 1971.
Oh, that's the council. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
So this isn't exactly a question, but just to, so sort of the whole idea about how much this model of the Citizens League study might be sort of resurrected for in the current environment. And I'd say one thing that hasn't come up here in this discussion at all is the difference now in the role that lobbyists play.
Oh,
That
right.
era, in the era of the 69, 70, there really wasn't, my understanding, there really wasn't much lobbyists around per se at all. And there was more of an innocence that this well-meaning group of people who took to study it and brought forward an issue could bring it right to the legislature, and they would evaluate it on its merits. Whereas in the current environment, they're just every possible interest group has a lobbyist around who's sniffing around at any sign of something that might be happening and trying to immediately assess, if it's going to help their clients or not, and who to activate among legislators in terms of being on guard. That it's definitely, I don't have an answer to it, but it seems like it's a big complicating factor to try to reinvigorate the model.
Can I just jump on that and say the role of the Star Tribune used to be significant, and they were very supportive of almost every citizen's proposal. And now,
And Dane, Pat, on that point, excuse me for interrupting you, but you raised it up and I couldn't help but jump on it. I did, when I was been working on this book, the history was made very easy because of the fact that the Star Tribune's, every single article from the Star Tribune from day one is online available. I had to pay a little money for it, but it wasn't a big deal. And all of a sudden, in the year, was it 95 or 2000? Certainly since 2000, maybe is it, the information just dropped off. There was no information whatsoever. The Battle of the Mall of America in 2013, I kept looking for articles in the early part of the session, couldn't find any anywhere. Finally, the only thing that showed up was Bob DeBoer's comments in the Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune, and then the final action. Nothing else. You're so right. The Star Tribune changed dramatically in their coverage.
Well, to pick up on Steve's question about the role of lobbyists, it seems to me that it isn't just lobbyists in general, where we tend to think of the private sector and special interest groups, but the units of government decided to get into the lobbying business significantly, paid people to represent them individually and collectively in a continuous way. And they advanced their particular interest to this discussion.
right.
One more thing about the Star Tribune. During my time as editor of the Minnesota Journal for the Citizens League, and this of course had been started by the league, but I continued on doing the what would the property tax be on a whatever $100,000 house in all the different municipalities, and then also the fiscal disparities thing, breakout of what difference that made to all the communities. And it was always a guaranteed front page story in the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press. And if you put that out today, I doubt it would be on the front page. But it was guaranteed, right, Paul?
That's right. That's right. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, those were the days.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we're getting on to wrapping it up.
I'll just bring up one more point, if I could, that I should have interjected a long time ago, but really in response, Clarence, when you mentioned about the governor's role and back as the program was created or first passed, I just wanted to mention the governor's role in the whole Mall of America stuff. That governor in the mid '80s, when the Mall of America was proposed, the governor Rudy Perpich was huge into that proposal, and he was signed on right away for exempting that development from fiscal disparities. And, you know, you could argue partly he wasn't a metro guy, so he didn't necessarily, you know, worry too much about the internal fiscal disparities, things that might cause, but the legislature did not go along with that. And in the end, they did give him a little bit of a benefit on the Mall of America, but nothing even close to what they were asking for, which was the exemption. And then, as Paul references, back in 2013, when they finally did get the exemption, a lot of that was because Governor Dayton supported the Mall of America wanted to extend its TIF district, and the governor supported that all the way, and the Bloomington legislators did not want to allow them to have to live without the benefit of that tax base going on into the future. And so that was really at the heart of the legislative sausage making that got this exemption in 2013 that had to do, again, largely because the governor came in so heavily in favor of sort of doing something different. So and to add that footnote to what we've been talked about earlier.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other?
Goodbye, Clarence. Thank you.